Hello Marvel fans, my name is Francis and welcome to my channel. So San Diego Comic Con just recently happened, and with that came an insane amount of information relating to many of Marvel's upcoming film and television projects. We even got a more detailed look at what is currently my most anticipated Marvel television project, which is X-Men 97. I love the original 90s X-Men cartoon. As a kid, that was my very first introduction to the X-Men, and everything I've seen so far really does feel like a natural continuation of the show. It's so exciting to see so many main and supporting characters return, along with them introducing new ones like Sunspot. And I'm also very excited to see what the dynamic of Magneto becoming the new leader of the X-Men will play out like. But ever since the announcement of X-Men 97, I have wondered, does Disney even have plans to revive the 90s Spider-Man animated series? And if so, hypothetically, what could that potentially look like, and should it even exist? I think there's a lot of good reasons for doing a revival, but at the same time I can also see some complex reasons as to why there shouldn't be a revival. So for this video, I'm going to go over the positives and the negatives towards doing a Spider-Man the Animated Series revival in the same vein as X-Men 97. I do personally lean towards wanting to see a revival, but I do understand that there could be some major drawbacks towards doing it. So let's start off with the positives. If we got a revival of Spider-Man the Animated Series, let's call it Spider-Man 98 for the sake of this topic. If the series were to pick up from the final episode of the original show, that means we will finally get to see Peter find Mary Jane after she's been stuck in that vortex for like 2 seasons. If you're a huge die-hard fan of the original 90s cartoon and you follow John Semper Jr.'s Making of Spider-Man the Animated Series Facebook page, you will know he has recently written a script that fully wraps up that plot thread and essentially acts like an epilogue to the original show. So for fans that have already read that script like myself, the main positive would be getting to see that script adapted. I know I've already read that script, but I would really like to see it animated. The next positive I could see with doing a revival show is that there's a chance to go back and wrap up other lingering plot threads the original series never resolved. For me, the biggest one that comes to mind is Miles Warren, with the help of Alistair Smythe, being able to potentially clone Spider-Man. Some of you are probably wondering right now, well, what's the point in redoing the Clone Saga? We already saw it play out. And yes, that is true, but you've got to remember that the version of the Clone Saga we saw in Spider-Wars was in Ben Reilly's universe, not the mainline Peter's universe. So there's still room for those events to play out in a different way. And I feel like there's so much narrative potential there when it comes to Peter and Mary Jane's relationship. Yes, he got her back after spending so much time trapped in that vortex, but she's actually missed out on so much. For Peter, marrying Mary Jane should have been one of the most happiest moments of his life, but now it's essentially been rendered null and void due to the fact he married a clone and not the real Mary Jane. And obviously, the real Mary Jane has no memory of her wedding because she wasn't actually there, so she got robbed of that moment for even herself to experience. It's this sort of drama that raises the primary question of, can Peter and Mary Jane salvage and maintain their marriage to each other after getting off to such a cosmic and rocky start? Plus, revisiting that Miles Warren tease means that if Peter discovers he's making clones, he'll want to go after him as Spider-Man and will have a lot of pent-up anger towards him, because some of his marriage problems are the result of Warren's obsession with clones. Additionally, there's also a lot of storytelling potential as to what Spider-Man would have to face in an arc like this. Logically, if Warren has Peter's DNA and he's also working with Smythe, then there's a danger that Alistair could potentially find out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. I also think it would be pretty cool that Spider-Man, having already seen a version of the Clone Saga happen in another universe, will believe that he's got the benefit of hindsight and feel like he knows what to expect, such as the creation of Ben Reilly the Scarlet Spider. But when it comes to meeting the clone that Warren has invented in his universe, it turns out it's not Ben Reilly and is instead Kane Parker, who is the second Scarlet Spider. And in the comics, Kane only recently became a Scarlet Spider within the past decade. So it's a way to retroactively work in a modern addition to the Spider-Man universe as if it always existed in the 90s continuity. But moving on to my third positive, I think that doing a Spider-Man 98 revival show would also be a really good chance to go back and adapt storylines the original series missed out on. For a lot of Spider-Man fans, there are two major storylines that people really want to see adapted, and both stories are long overdue an adaptation considering they were made ages ago during the 80s. The two storylines I'm referring to are Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut and Kraven's Last Hunt. Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut is a storyline that pretty much feels perfect for a Spider-Man the Animated Series revival, especially if it was airing alongside X-Men 97 on Disney+, with Juggernaut appearing in that show and then appearing in a Spider-Man 98 show, essentially resurrecting that 90s Marvel Animated Universe continuity for a modern audience. For those that are unfamiliar with the Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut storyline, it's basically a story where Spider-Man is constantly doing his best to stop Juggernaut from getting to Madam Web, but everything he does just does not work. And it's a really good David and Goliath tale that demonstrates Spider-Man's determination and insistence on never giving up, and it's why fans really want to see this story adapted one day. When it comes to Kraven's Last Hunt, a lot of people already know that this is one of, if not the darkest Spider-Man stories ever told, where Kraven the Hunter essentially buries Spider-Man underground for 2 weeks to take on the role of Spider-Man to prove that once and for all he is superior to Spider-Man. Naturally, a lot of us Spider-Man fans want to see this storyline properly adapted one day. Even the original writer, JMD Mateus, is eager to see that story adapted, and it would be brilliant to have him involved, not only because he's the original writer, but because he's also partly responsible for some of the better DC animated movies in the past few years, like Superman Red Son. It would be cool to see Kraven's Last Hunt done in a similar manner as one of those DC animated movies, but with the complex Marvel Sony film rights issues relating to Spider-Man and the fact that Sony also wants to do their stupid solo Kraven the Hunter film, it seems very unlikely that a film adaptation is going to happen in the near future. However, if it was done as a story arc for a potential Spider-Man 98 revival show, that might actually be a decent alternative as opposed to doing a film adaptation. Continuing off from Spider-Man the Animated Series means that 98 will naturally fit some of the criteria needed in order to tell Kraven's Last Hunt. JMD Mateus has expressed that if that story were to be adapted, Peter needs to be an adult and he needs to be married, which are both things that Peter would technically already be in 98. Moving on to my next positive is that the original Spider-Man 90s cartoon was well known for crossing over with other heroes in the wider Marvel universe. He teamed up with the likes of Blade, the X-Men, Iron Man, Daredevil, and many more, but there were still some other heroes that we unfortunately did not get to see the 90s Spider-Man interact with, like Ghost Rider, Thor, the Incredible Hulk, Hawkeye, Black Widow, Ant-Man, the Wasp, and Black Panther, just to name a few. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that if a show like Spider-Man 98 were to exist that I want Marvel heroes popping up every week. I don't. In fact, one of the best aspects of the original show was that there was a good balance between the amount of episodes where you get Peter on his own and the ones where he teams up with other Marvel heroes. I feel like a Spider-Man 98 show would need to recapture that essence of it being primarily focused on Peter/Spider-Man, but we can also make room for additional episodes where there are team-ups. Moving on to my next point, which has nothing to do with potential storylines, but obviously animation has come a long way since the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, and hopefully that means for Spider-Man 98 there would be better animation and better editing. Obviously there is some enjoyment to be had in looking back on the original 90s cartoon and spotting some animation errors, some janky bits of editing, and even noticing some odd placements of recycled animation, which I don't consider that much of a big deal since a lot of productions like to recycle their animation footage. Yes, it is admittedly weird when you can tell that some scenes have been pulled from other episodes and have been injected into sequences where they clearly do not fit, but to a lot of us those sort of moments don't really take away from Spider-Man the Animated Series that much when the stories are just so well told. For myself, there was only really one editing error that completely ruined my enjoyment of one of the episodes, and that comes from the last part of the Six Forgotten Warriors story arc. In that episode, there's supposed to be a sequence in which Spider-Man and Captain America infiltrate the Red Skull's base, but then they are suddenly ambushed by Red Skull and Chameleon. The sequence should then cut to another plot point in the episode before cutting back to Captain America and Spider-Man having to fight back against Red Skull and Chameleon. However, in the actual episode, that sequence of events is in the complete wrong order. When I binge watched the show on Disney Plus for the first time and I got to this episode, I kept having to rewind the episode multiple times thinking that I'd accidentally missed a scene because I wasn't paying attention, but it turns out it was nothing to do with me not paying attention. It's just the fact that the editor made a massive mistake when it came to editing the sequence of events in the right order. So hopefully a revival show would mean less of that, basically. My last positive is that not only has animation come a long way since the 90s, but so have television broadcast standards and practices. If a show like Spectacular Spider-Man is anything to go off of, then it seems that restrictions related to what you can and can't do in a superhero animated show have lessened quite a bit. In the finale of the first season of Spectacular Spider-Man, there's this massive fight scene that Spider-Man and Venom have at a Thanksgiving parade, but it's filled with moments where glass is constantly being broken, and even Venom has got Spider-Man by the throat at one point. And those two key details, broken glass and strangulation, were two things that superhero cartoons airing on Fox were not allowed to depict during the 90s. Batman the Animated Series co-creator Bruce Timm even drew an illustration piece of what was considered taboo for animated shows during the 90s, and it's important not to get this stuff mixed up with censorship, which is something that Spider-Man the Animated Series often gets wrongly accused of. And I think a part of the reason for that is due to the fact that people tend to use the term censorship interchangeably with television broadcast standards and practices without knowing the differences between the two or even what censorship actually means. In order for a television show to get censored, you would have had to have actually made something that the network would consider offensive. People love to jump the gun and say, oh, Spider-Man wasn't allowed to punch his enemies, that's censorship. Oh, the police and criminals have laser guns instead of actual guns, that's censorship. Oh, the dialogue is limited because they can't say certain words, censorship. But in those instances, you're kind of mislabeling what censorship actually is. There isn't any alternate cuts of these episodes where Spider-Man is punching criminals or everyone seemed to be using real guns. There's no cuts of the Insidious 6 episodes where they're actually referred to as the Sinister Six. None of this is censorship, it's just a way these episodes were created within the limits of the broadcast standards and practices. An actual proper example of censorship comes from one of the DVD releases of Spider-Man the Animated Series. On the Spider-Man Ultimate Villain Showdown DVD, the Enter the Green Goblin episode is actually missing the scene where the Green Goblin's massive glider crashes into a building. On UK PAL copies of that DVD, that moment is actually classed as a deleted scene in the bonus features of that DVD release. There's no official reasoning as to why that scene was cut, but we can probably assume that the scene was removed due to the fact that 9/11 had only recently happened at that point in time when the DVD came out. Obviously, this was a decision clearly made by the home video release people, and I don't blame them for doing this. It's perfectly reasonable and understandable as to why they would remove that scene given the circumstances. And I'm only using this particular example as it really showcases what censorship is actually like. That when you censor something, you are suppressing the contents of already made material that can be considered quite triggering. But back to the idea that broadcast standards and practices are less restrictive. If those restrictions have eased off, hopefully that means a Spider-Man 98 show can get away with doing much greater action set pieces than what could have been done in the original show. It could allow modern animators to get very creative with fight choreography and injecting more fast-paced action than what could have been done in the original show. So that about does it for my positives. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go over what I consider to be some of the biggest negatives as to why I also think there maybe should shouldn't be a Spider-Man 98 revival show. The first big negative is the fact that many of the show's voice actors have sadly passed away in the years since the original show ended. We're talking about voice actors that have played roles such as Kingpin, Dr. Octopus, Madam Web, and even recently we lost Ed Asner and David Warner, who were the voices of J. Jonah Jameson and Herbert Landon. And one of the best things about the original show was that nearly every single character is pretty much perfectly cast. And a part of me personally thinks it would be way too difficult to recast some of these characters, given how strong their original performers were. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, it's just animation. Recasting is much easier when it comes to an animated show. And to that, I say there are multiple examples of animated shows, like The Simpsons or Family Guy, where a voice actor or voice actress has died and they've gone out of respect for the original performers, we are going to write out and retire the characters that they played. And when it comes to a character like J. Jonah Jameson, I feel like the right thing to do in a revival show would be to respectfully write him out of the series. I get that some people would think, but he's such a cool character, why not just get J.K. Simmons to play the role instead? It wouldn't feel like the same take though, is the problem. Ed Asner genuinely made the role his own in that series, and if you recast him with someone like J.K. Simmons, then it's not going to feel like the same take. I do love J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, but I don't think they should necessarily bring him into this just to replace such an iconic take on that character. I can also see some instances where recasting characters is going to become unavoidable. Stan Lee's wife, Joan Lee, gave such an incredible performance as Madam Web. She brought to life a character that many people probably didn't care that much about, including the execs like Avi Arad, and now, ironically, Sony Pictures is trying to make a film out of that character. And when it comes to a 90s Spider-Man revival, I wouldn't feel comfortable with her being recast, but because her character is quite integral to storylines like Peter Finds Mary Jane and Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, it could potentially be an instance where trying to avoid recasting older characters like Madam Web wouldn't be feasible, sadly. The second negative I have is actually related to the amount of episodes a 90s Spider-Man revival could get in its first season. Hypothetically, if we're holding it to the same standards as X-Men 97, that means season 1 would consist of 10 episodes. Now, I don't have a problem with this when it comes to X-Men 97, and plus that show has already been greenlit for a season 2, so that show is guaranteed 20 episodes at least. However, when it comes to Spider-Man, I'm slightly more worried about a first season only having 10 episodes. It has been a while since I read the Peter Finds Mary Jane script, but I do remember that John Semper Jr. specifies that the script is longer than a typical episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series. Now, it would be awesome to see a Spider-Man 98 premiere on Disney Plus that's like 70 minutes long, basically being given the same treatment as the animated show Star Wars Bad Batch. However, we've got to remember that while yes, Disney and Marvel own the television rights for Spider-Man, Sony still owns the film rights. We do not know if there is some arrangement between Sony and Disney where there are legal limitations as to how long a Spider-Man television project can go over in terms of runtime. Let's say Disney and Marvel do want to make the Peter Finds Mary Jane episode 70 minutes long, but then Sony have a right to come in and say, well, you can't do that because that borders on it being a feature-length film, in which case the work around that issue would have to be splitting that story up into multiple episodes. I'm just worried that the limit of 10 episodes would not be enough to allow the writers to tell the stories they want to tell. And if we're committing to the idea that the first season would have 10 episodes, comparing that to the original 90s cartoon, that's shorter than any season of Spider-Man the Animated Series. And I'm not saying that if there was a Spider-Man 98 show, they would definitely do Kraven's Last Hunt. That's just me saying what I'd really want to see happen. But let's just say they did want to do it. And if you're someone like me that is a huge fan of Kraven's Last Hunt, you will know that story needs room in order to tell it. The original story was 6 issues long. Now, obviously, I don't work in film and television, but I'm just taking a guess, and I think that it would take at least 3 episodes to tell the actual story. However, I do also think there would need to be some sort of prequel episode to help set up the actual story. Just going from Peter finds Mary Jane directly into Kraven's Last Hunt would feel extremely jarring. It's easy when you read the story on its own that you can just naturally accept the continuity that you're given. Elements like Peter having a cloth version of the black suit. The story never provides an explanation as to why he has that costume, but as you read it, you naturally accept the idea anyway. And I think that when it comes to adapting this story into animation, you need to streamline certain elements of it. So I think doing a prequel episode in Spider-Man 98 would give you the benefit of being able to properly introduce the character of Vermin, give a plausible reason for the cloth black suit to exist in the 90s Spider-Man continuity, and invent some form of motivation as to why the 90s animated version of Kraven would suddenly go after Spider-Man. These are all things that would need to be explained to the viewer before actually doing the story, and all of this feeds into my issues about having a season that's only 10 episodes long. If we do the math dedicating 2 episodes to Peter finds Mary Jane, plus the idea that 4 episodes would be needed for Kraven's Last Hunt, that's over half a season already gone. My third issue is actually related to the idea that the broadcast standards and practices might be eased off for a revival show. Of course, when you initially think about those restrictions being eased off means the show could be more creative and they're not as limited as they were before, and it's also worth keeping in mind that it would be airing on a streaming service like Disney Plus and not an actual television network. However, the concern I have is that if you go overboard with this lack of restrictions, would it still be able to feel like a natural continuation of the original show? If they decided to use real guns instead of laser guns for Spider-Man 98, then that kind of takes away from the original show's look. And as silly as the laser guns may have been to some viewers, I personally thought they were quite cool. But in a way, they partly formed the original show's visual identity, if that makes sense. Also, if a new show allowed the 90s Spider-Man to constantly punch people in the face, would that create the inverse of some of those complaints certain fans had with the original show? Would we hear some people go from complaints like, "Oh, the show sucks because Spider-Man doesn't punch anyone," to a new show where he actually does do that, but the complaint this time around is, "Oh, this show sucks because he's punching people too much, and in the original show he never would have done that." We know that X-Men 97 is going to have a new team of writers, and Eric and Julia Leewald are there to help them as consultants. The show will be a continuation of what they did in the 90s, but it's still going to feel like its own thing. And I am open to the idea of a Spider-Man 98 show bringing on some new, fresh writing staff, but they have to be the type of people that are constantly assessing and reassessing their work in order to make sure they're not writing the 90s Spider-Man in a way that seems out of character, which you can imagine would be a difficult balancing act. It needs to feel like the original show, but at the same time it needs to feel like a new one. But these types of writing concerns I have don't just stop there, because my next negative is that there's ultimately a danger in reviving Spider-Man the Animated Series. Because for the original show, it kind of peaked where it ended. If someone were to ask me what my favourite episodes of the 90s Spider-Man cartoon were, I'd definitely say the last 2 episodes. Not only is that where the show's threat level is at its highest, but Spider-Man is also in a place where he's the most confident in himself. Throughout the original show, he deals with plenty of problems as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and come the end of the series, he's completely happy with both parts of his life. So his character arc throughout the series had reached its natural conclusion. But of course, people love to respond to this by saying the show actually ended on a cliffhanger, we never saw Peter actually find Mary Jane. And I hate to break it to people that think that way about Spider-Man the Animated Series, but that is technically not a cliffhanger. Typically, a cliffhanger is where your story ends on a very dangerous and dramatic moment that leaves the fate of its main characters unknown to the viewer. We all know that a show like Spectacular Spider-Man was cancelled way too early, but to say that show ended on an unresolved cliffhanger is not true. Come the end of Season 2's Green Goblin arc, no one in the main cast is in any danger whatsoever. Even the showrunner of that series, Greg Weisman, has had to make that clear to fans at conventions that that is not a cliffhanger. A real example of a show ending on a cliffhanger comes from Spider-Man Unlimited. And spoiler alert for those that haven't seen it, but the way that show ends is essentially rocks fall, everyone dies. Yes, I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, and I'm sure if the show was allowed to continue, they would have shown Peter Peter and everyone else surviving, but the fact Unlimited ends with its protagonist and the fates of many other characters left unknown, and in a situation that's filled with peril, means that it's a cliffhanger. And I do understand where people are coming from in regards to Spider-Man the animated series, saying that we don't see Mary Jane come the end of the series, so that must qualify as a cliffhanger. But you've got to take on board that the final conversation between Spider-Man and Madam Web heavily implies they're going to get her back regardless of what the threat is. And at that point, to our knowledge as viewers, she's only just floating around this massive vortex. There's no real danger if all they have to do is go get her. But anyway, back to what might become an issue if Disney and Marvel were to do more of Spider-Man the animated series. Let's say they show Peter getting Mary Jane back, but then decide to explore stories that showcase problems with them being married under bizarre circumstances. That could risk undoing Peter's arc from the end of the original series. And as much as I'd like to see a story like Kraven's Last Hunt be adapted, I'm fully aware there's one big obstacle towards doing it, and that's Kraven himself. In the 90s Spider-Man continuity, he's primarily a good guy, and he even gets a happy ending with his wife Calypso. To turn Kraven into a villain again just for the sake of doing that story would feel like a huge disservice to how he's portrayed in the original show if it is not handled correctly. So a revival show would need to take into consideration the way characters' arcs were finished in the original show and try to honour them as best they can. Finally, my last negative towards there being a Spider-Man 98 show is related to the idea that Disney and Marvel could hypothetically go forward with it without the inclusion of John Semper Jr. He's the original showrunner of Spider-Man the animated series, so he absolutely needs to be involved. Otherwise, there's genuinely no point in them making it. He's even recently said in an interview that he is open to the idea of doing a continuation, but only if Disney and Marvel were willing to give him the same amount of creative freedom that he received after the first season of the original show. Because once Avi Arad stopped working on the show, John didn't have to argue with him anymore, and at that point onwards he pretty much had access to the entire Marvel universe, and is why we were able to see storylines like Secret Wars be adapted. Also, if they wanted to adapt Peter Finds Mary Jane, John is going to deserve more than just a consultant credit. It's a full-on writer's credit, and it would be extremely disrespectful for them to just do their own thing without his inclusion. He wrote almost every single episode of the original show, and even the ones he didn't write, he still looked at. You can make the argument that if John doesn't come back, they can always just disregard his Peter Finds Mary Jane script because it currently exists as fan fiction, but the problem with that is it's fan fiction coming from the original showrunner, so that carries a hell of a lot more weight to it. So that's where I stand on the possibility of there being a Spider-Man the animated series revival. I would like to see one and think there are many good reasons for Disney and Marvel to do it, but at the same time I understand there are barriers that call to question whether or not there should really even be one. Currently it seems very unlikely to happen within the next few years, as Marvel is already hard at work on making another Spider-Man show called Spider-Man Freshman Year, and it's even already been greenlit for a season 2. And while I am excited for Freshman Year, I can't help but feel that if that show didn't exist, it would still feel quite hard to tell how much Disney and Marvel actually value Spider-Man the animated series. Outside of toy merchandise, the occasional variant cover, and even the odd article on Marvel's website, Disney just doesn't seem to draw that much attention to it as they do with X-Men the animated series, and it just gives you the vibe that they view the show as a lesser product, which is just the wrong attitude to have about the show. For a lot of people, myself included, that show was their first introduction to Spider-Man, and I'm always going to treasure the fact that Christopher Daniel Barnes was the very first Spider-Man voice I heard as a kid, and I'm sure many other people feel that way as well. Hopefully in the future, studios like Disney, Marvel and Sony will actually start to show some appreciation towards the 90s cartoon and spectacular, as those are the shows that have primarily influenced the movies the most when it comes to their narratives. But that about does it for this video. Thank you for tuning in if you've managed to make it all the way to the end. I know there's been a bit of a longer gap between this video and my previous one, but that's only because I wanted to put a lot of effort into talking about this topic, as I have a lot of passion for both Spider-Man and the X-Men. So feel free to leave a comment down below, let me know whether or not you want to see a Spider-Man the Animated Series revival, and tell me your current hype levels for X-Men 97 and Spider-Man Freshman Year. Once again, my name is Francis, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll hear from you all soon.